Welcome back to Mr. Cursed. The Appalachian Mountains hide things that shouldn't exist. Today, 6 people share what they saw growing up there, and trust me, you won't sleep tonight. Before the horror begins, subscribe, like, and drop your location below. Okay, deep breath. Let's step into the nightmare. I was 12 years old when Daddy lost his job at the lumber mill, and honestly, I thought my world was ending. We'd been living in the same little house outside Asheville my whole life, and suddenly we were packing everything we owned into the back of Daddy's old Ford pickup. Mama kept saying it was just temporary, that we'd be back before Christmas, but I could tell by the way Daddy's jaw stayed clenched that he wasn't so sure. The mill had been the heart of our little community for 3 generations, and when it shut down, it took half the town with it. Uncle Roy had called the night before Daddy got his pink slip, like he somehow knew what was coming. He owned a tobacco farm up in Madison County, about 2 hours north of us, and he needed help with the harvest season. Family takes care of family, he told Daddy over the phone, and I remember thinking how lucky we were to have somewhere to go. Looking back now, I wonder if luck had anything to do with it, or if Uncle Roy had been waiting for this moment longer than any of us realized. The drive up to Uncle Roy's place took us through some of the prettiest country I'd ever seen. Rolling hills covered in every shade of green you could imagine, with morning mist hanging in the valleys like something out of a picture book. Daddy had grown up on that farm before he moved to town to work at the mill, but this was my first time seeing it. As we turned onto the gravel road that led to the farmhouse, Daddy got quiet in a way that made my stomach twist. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept glancing in the rearview mirror like something might be following us. Uncle Roy met us at the end of his long driveway, a tall man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He hugged Daddy like they hadn't seen each other in years, which I guess they hadn't, and ruffled my hair in that way adults do when they're not sure what else to say to a kid. But there was something in the way he looked at me, a kind of measuring look, like he was trying to figure out what I might be capable of. "Welcome home, brother," Uncle Roy said to Daddy, and the word home hung in the air with weight I didn't understand yet. The farmhouse was older than anything I'd ever lived in, built back when the mountains were still full of Cherokee before they got forced out on the Trail of Tears. Wide front porches with hand-hewn support beams and rooms that creaked when you walked through them, not from age but from all the memories soaked into the wood. Uncle Roy had fixed up the back bedroom for me and Daddy, while Mama got the small room next to the kitchen that had once been a root cellar. "Y'all make yourselves at home," he said, but there was something in his voice that made it sound more like a binding than an invitation. He showed Daddy around the property that first afternoon, pointing out the tobacco fields that stretched from the back of the house all the way to the tree line where the old-growth forest began. The plants were tall and broad-leafed, ready for harvest, and Uncle Roy talked about them like they were his children, or maybe his congregation. That's when I first saw old Pete. He stood right in the center of the biggest field, arms stretched wide like he was conducting some silent symphony only he could hear. From a distance, he looked like any other scarecrow, but as we got closer, I realized there was something fundamentally wrong about him. Instead of a burlap sack stuffed with straw for a head, old Pete had a carved wooden face that looked almost human. Too human. The features were carved with obsessive detail, deep-set eyes that seemed to follow you when you moved, weathered cheeks that looked like they'd seen decades of sun and rain, and a mouth that was slightly open like he was about to speak, or maybe like he'd been caught mid-scream and frozen that way. "That there's old Pete," Uncle Roy said, and I swear, there was reverence in his voice, the kind you hear in church when the preacher talks about mysteries beyond human understanding. "Best scarecrow in 3 counties. Haven't lost a single plant to birds or pests in all the years he's been standing guard." He reached out and patted the scarecrow's wooden arm like it was an old friend, and I noticed his hand lingered there longer than it should have. "Been protecting these crops for over 50 years now. My granddaddy put him up during the worst of the Depression, and he's been faithful ever since." I noticed right away that the tobacco plants around old Pete were different from the others. They grew bigger and greener, their leaves broader and more perfect than anywhere else in the field, like they were being fed something the other plants weren't getting. But there were other things too, things that made my skin crawl, even though I couldn't put my finger on why. No insects buzzed around old Pete's post. Not one. The air near him, felt cold, even on that warm September afternoon, and it tasted metallic on your tongue, like blood or old pennies. And when the wind blew through the rest of the field, making the tobacco leaves rustle and dance like they were alive, the area around the scarecrow stayed perfectly still, like it existed in its own pocket of dead air. Uncle Roy noticed me staring and got that measuring look again. He's something special, ain't he? Been in our family longer than anyone can remember. My granddaddy always said Pete understood the land better than any of us ever could. The way he said understood made it sound like old Pete was still learning. Daddy started working as Uncle Roy's farmhand the next morning, and I was given smaller tasks around the property. Feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, helping Mama with the vegetable garden she'd decided to tend behind the house. It should have been peaceful work, the kind of simple country life that city folks write poems about. But I found myself constantly distracted by old Pete standing silent sentinel in the tobacco field. Every time I walked past, I felt like those painted eyes were not just watching me, but studying me, memorizing every detail of how I moved and talked and breathed. The chickens wouldn't go anywhere near the fence that bordered Pete's field. I noticed that the first week we were there, how they'd scratch and peck all the way up to an invisible line about 20 feet from the fence, then turn and walk away like they'd hit a wall. Even Rufus, Uncle Roy's old hound dog, who'd supposedly never met a stranger, would whine and tuck his tail whenever he had to cross that part of the yard. Uncle Roy had a way of talking about the Depression that made it sound like yesterday instead of decades ago. He'd grown up hearing stories from his daddy about those hard times, about how folks would do anything to survive, about how the mountains had been full of desperate people making desperate choices. "You can't judge what people did back then," he'd say while we worked in the fields. "You ain't never been hungry like that. Ain't never watched your babies cry from empty bellies while the government men came around asking questions about taxes and regulations and proper this and legal that." His voice would get tight when he talked about place go. Government men, like the words left a bad taste in his mouth. Some folks thought they knew better than the people who'd been working this land since before there was a United States of America. Thought they could come in with their papers and their rules and tell mountain people how to live. He'd glance over at old Pete when he said things like this, and I started to get the feeling there was more to the story than he was telling. The first time I heard Pete speak, I was checking the irrigation lines that ran through the field. It was early morning, maybe around 7, and the mist was still hanging low between the rows of tobacco, like the ghosts of all the people who'd ever worked this land. I was kneeling down, trying to clear a clogged sprinkler head, when I heard my name carried on the wind. "Sarah." The voice was soft, like wind through dry corn stalks, but it was definitely saying my name. Not calling it exactly, but tasting it, like someone trying to remember how words worked. I stood up and looked around, thinking maybe Daddy or Uncle Roy was calling me, but I was alone in the field, except for the tobacco plants and old Pete. That's when I looked directly at the scarecrow and felt my blood turn to ice water. The wooden mouth had moved, just slightly, but enough that I could tell it had been different a moment before. And those painted blue eyes, I swear they had shifted to look directly at me. Not the blank stare of a painted face, but the focused attention of something that was very much aware I was there. "Sarah," the voice said again. And this time I saw the mouth move with the words. The carved lips parted just enough to let the sound escape, and I could see something dark moving behind the wooden teeth. I dropped the sprinkler head and ran. Didn't stop running until I reached the farmhouse, where I found Daddy sitting on the porch with his morning coffee, looking out over the fields like he was trying to solve a puzzle he'd been working on for years. I told him what happened, the words tumbling out so fast I could barely catch my breath. Daddy listened with that patient expression he got when he thought I was letting my imagination run away with me, but there was something else in his face too, a kind of worried recognition, like he'd been expecting this conversation. "It's just the wind, baby girl," he said, pulling me down to sit beside him on the porch swing. "Old scarecrows like that, they creak and shift when the wind hits them just right, makes all kinds of noises that can sound like voices if you're not expecting them. This old mountain air, it plays tricks on your ears." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But I knew what I'd heard, and I knew what I'd seen. That wasn't wind making noise. That was something else entirely, something that knew my name and wanted me to know it was watching. Uncle Roy overheard the tail end of our conversation as he came out for his own coffee. He got very quiet when Daddy explained what I'd told him, and I saw something pass between them. A look that carried decades of shared knowledge and mutual understanding about things they'd both hoped would stay buried. Uncle Roy set his coffee cup down with shaking hands and pulled Daddy aside for a private conversation that lasted nearly an hour. They walked out toward the barn, where I couldn't hear them, but I could see Uncle Roy's hands moving as he talked, gesturing toward the field, toward old Pete, toward the house where Mama and I were waiting. When they came back, both men looked like they'd aged years in the span of that conversation. That night, after Mama had gone to bed and Daddy thought I was asleep, I crept out of my room and listened at the top of the stairs. The old house carried sound in strange ways, and I could hear every word they said in the kitchen below. What I heard made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about my family. "She can't be making this up, Roy," Daddy was saying, and his voice had the kind of strain in it that came from trying to hold together something that was already falling apart. "She's never been one to tell tall tales, and she described exactly what I used to hear when I was her age." "I know she's not making it up," Uncle Roy replied, and his voice sounded tired, like he was carrying a weight he'd been holding for 50 years and was finally too old to bear it alone. "That's exactly what worries me. It means he's getting stronger again. Strong enough to reach out to someone new." There was a long pause, and when Uncle Roy spoke, again, his voice was so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "I never told you the whole truth about old Pete, did I, Samuel? You said he was Granddaddy's scarecrow. Been protecting the crops for decades, keeping the farm profitable when everyone else was struggling. That part's true. But there's more to it, and if that thing is talking to your little girl, then you need to know all of it." Uncle Roy sighed, and I heard the floorboards creak as he shifted in his chair. During the Depression, times were harder than you can imagine now. People were starving, not just here, but everywhere, and the government men were coming around asking questions about how certain farms were staying profitable when others were failing. Granddaddy was barely keeping this place afloat, and people in town were dying of hunger. My hands gripped the stair railing as Uncle Roy continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a story that had been told and retold until it had worn smooth grooves in his memory. "A drifter named Pete showed up one autumn, right around harvest time, looking for work in exchange for room and board. He was educated, not like most of the men who came through looking for farm work, could read and write, knew about agriculture from books instead of just experience. Granddaddy took him on because we needed the help, and Pete was willing to work for next to nothing, just food and a place to sleep in the barn." I heard Daddy pour himself another cup of coffee, the liquid hitting the ceramic with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. "Pete was a good man," Uncle Roy continued. "Hardworking, honest, kind to everyone he met. Had principles, you see. Strong ones. And when he discovered what Granddaddy was doing to keep the farm profitable during those lean years, well, Pete couldn't stand for it." "What was Granddaddy doing?" "What? Mixing sawdust with flour and selling it to hungry families in town, cutting cornmeal with ground-up tree bark, selling rotten meat that he'd treated with chemicals to hide the smell. People were so desperate they'd buy anything that looked like food, and Granddaddy was giving them poison and calling it salvation." I felt sick to my stomach. This was the family legacy Daddy had grown up with, the farm that had supposedly been built with honest work and mountain values. Pete found the sawdust bags in the barn, found the chemical treatments Granddaddy was using on the meat. He confronted Granddaddy about it, said he was going to report him to the authorities, make sure people in town knew what they were really eating. Said it was murder, just slower than a gun. What did Granddaddy do? What he thought he had to do to protect his family and his livelihood. Uncle Roy's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He called his brothers over, your great-uncles Thomas and James, and they cornered Pete one night in the tobacco field, beat him to death with farming tools and buried him right where he fell, right in the center of that field where the soil was richest. The kitchen went silent except for the tick of the old clock on the mantel, counting out seconds like a heartbeat. Then Granddaddy got an idea. Said if they were going to kill a man on the land, they might as well make use of him. He carved Pete's likeness out of oak wood, spent weeks on it, getting every detail of his face just right, put it on a post over Pete's grave, and told everyone it was a scarecrow he'd made to protect the crops. But it was more than that, Daddy said, and it wasn't really a question. Granddaddy always believed in the old ways, the Cherokee magic that was in these mountains long before our people came. He figured if he trapped Pete's spirit to the land, bound him with wood and ritual and the weight of unavenged murder, then Pete could never tell anyone what happened. Could never report Granddaddy to the authorities, because dead men can't testify. I heard a chair scrape against the floor, like someone was shifting uncomfortably. But that kind of binding, it comes with a price. Pete's spirit was angry, trapped, and every year it's gotten stronger, feeding on the crops, absorbing life from the soil and the plants and anything that gets too close. The tobacco around Old Pete grows better than anywhere else because it's fertilized with 50 years of accumulated rage. And now he's talking to Sarah, which means he's strong enough to date, reach beyond the binding. Strong enough to start influencing people again. Uncle Roy paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was full of a fear that seemed to come from deep in his bones. I've been waiting for this day my whole life, Samuel. Waiting for Pete to get powerful enough to take his revenge on this family. And I think he's finally ready. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. Poor Pete, murdered for trying to do the right thing, trapped for 50 years in a wooden prison while his killer's family profited from his death. When Mama asked me to take some fresh water out to the field workers, I made sure to bring an extra cup. I walked straight up to Old Pete and set the water at the base of his post, my hands shaking as I did it. I know what happened to you, I whispered, looking up into those two real painted eyes. I know what they did. I'm sorry. Thank you, child, came that wind through dry stalk's voice, and this time I didn't flinch away from it. You're the first person to show kindness in all these years. The first person to acknowledge what was done to me. The wooden mouth moved as he spoke, and I could see now that the eyes weren't just painted. They were alive, aware, full of an intelligence that had been growing and learning for half a century. I'm not mad at everyone, Pete continued, his voice gaining strength and becoming more human with each word. Just at the family that murdered me, the ones who trapped me here to guard the crops they built with blood money. Over the next few days, I started bringing Pete water and even small bits of food from the kitchen, though I wasn't sure if a spirit could actually eat. We talked, or rather, he talked and I listened. He told me about his life before coming to the farm, about the woman he'd loved who died of tuberculosis before they could marry, about his dreams of having a family and maybe a small farm of his own. He'd been educated at a teacher's college, had wanted to help people learn to read and write and think for themselves. Most of all, he talked about justice, about how wrong it was for good people to suffer while evil ones prospered. I've had 50 years to think about it, Pete said during one of our conversations. 50 years to watch this family profit from murder while the people they poisoned died slow, painful deaths. Children, Sarah. Babies who died because they ate sawdust instead of flour. Old folks who trusted your great-grandfather and paid for it with their lives. The wooden face was becoming more expressive each time we talked, more human. The painted features were deepening, gaining dimension, and sometimes I could swear I saw actual flesh beneath the wood. My bones are still down there, he said one afternoon, his wooden head tilting toward the ground at the base of his post. If someone could give them a proper burial, say some words over them, maybe I could find enough peace to let go of this anger. Maybe I could forgive and move on. But even as he said it, I could hear the doubt in his voice. 50 years of rage and injustice had carved themselves deep into his spirit, and I wasn't sure forgiveness was possible anymore. That night, I waited until everyone was asleep and snuck out of the house with a shovel from the tool shed. Pete guided me to the exact spot, about 3 feet to the left of his post, where the tobacco grew thickest and greenest. The ground was soft and dark, rich with decades of supernatural fertilization. I dug carefully, trying not to make too much noise, but the soil seemed to want to give up its secrets. It practically fell away from my shovel. 3 feet down, I hit something solid. Bones. Human bones, wrapped in the rotted remains of what must have been Pete's clothes. There was a wallet too, cracked leather with a name printed inside. Peter Andrew Morrison, born 1905. He'd been only 29 when they killed him, younger than Daddy was now. As soon as I touched the skull, everything changed. The wooden head above me began to shift and change, the carved features becoming more lifelike. Actual flesh grew over the wood, skin that looked weathered and sunburned but undeniably human. The painted blue eyes blinked, real and wet with tears that had been 50 years in the coming. Pete's voice, when he spoke, was fully human now, rich with emotion and terrible purpose. "Almost free," he whispered, and I could hear both hope and something darker in his voice. "Almost ready for justice." But then I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Uncle Roy standing at the edge of the field with a shotgun in his hands. He was wearing his nightclothes and boots, like he'd been waiting for this moment, expecting it. "Put them bones back, girl," he said, his voice shaking but determined. "Put them back right now, or we'll all pay a price that's been 50 years in the making." "He just wants a proper burial," I said, standing up with Pete's skull cradled in my arms. The bone felt warm, like it was alive. "He just wants justice for what your family did to him." "That thing ain't looking for justice anymore," Uncle Roy said, raising the shotgun. His hands were trembling, but his eyes were hard with the kind of determination that comes from a lifetime of carrying terrible knowledge. "It's been growing stronger all these years, feeding on hate and anger until there's nothing left of the man top it used to be. You let it loose, and it won't stop with just killing me. It'll take out my whole bloodline, including you and your daddy." But it was too late. Pete's spirit was rising from the scarecrow's body, no longer bound to the wooden form. He stood between Uncle Roy and me, and I could see that 50 years of imprisonment and growing rage had changed him into something far beyond the gentleman he'd once been. His form was translucent but solid-looking, and his face, his real face, not the carved wooden version, was terrible with accumulated fury. "You killed me," Pete said to Uncle Roy, and his voice carried the weight of half a century of injustice. "Beat me to death for trying to save the people you were poisoning. Trapped my spirit to guard the crops you built with murder and fraud. Now you take my place, and your family can guard my grave for the next 50 years. Uncle Roy tried to run, but he only made it a few steps before he stopped, his body going rigid like invisible hands had grabbed hold of him. I watched in horror as his skin began to dry and crack like old leather. His limbs became stiff and wooden, his eyes losing their human warmth and becoming fixed and painted. The shotgun fell from his hands as his fingers fused together and hardened into carved wood. Within minutes, Uncle Roy had become the new scarecrow, conscious and aware but unable to move or speak, only able to watch with wooden eyes as his world transformed around him. Pete's ghost turned to me, and for a moment I saw a flicker of the kind man he'd been in life. The anger was still there, burning like a furnace in his translucent form, but there was something else too, a deep sadness that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "Thank you for freeing me, child," he said, his voice growing fainter as whatever was keeping him tied to this world began to loosen. "You showed me kindness when no one else would, and that's something I'll remember, even after I'm gone from this place. But know this, the debt isn't fully paid yet. Your family built their prosperity on murder and poison, and blood debts echo through generations until someone makes them right." His eyes shifted to the farmhouse where Daddy and Mama were sleeping, unaware that everything had just changed forever. "Father is a good man, better than his grandfather ever was. But he's benefited from blood money his whole life, even if he didn't know it. The choice of what to do about that, that's on him now. And on you, when you're old enough to understand what inheritance really means." Pete's form was becoming more and more transparent, like morning mist burning off under the sun. "I'm going to my rest now, finally. But this land remembers everything that's ever happened on it, and the mountains don't forgive easily. Your family has a choice to make about what kind of people they want to be going forward." And then he was gone, fading away like smoke on the wind, leaving me alone in the field with Uncle Roy's bones in my hands and a new scarecrow watching over the tobacco with eyes that were very much alive and very much afraid. I reburied Pete's bones properly and said what prayers I could remember over the grave. When I looked up, the scarecrow that had been Uncle Roy was staring down at me with wooden eyes that held a terrible awareness. I could see the recognition there, the pleading, the desperate hope that somehow this nightmare could be undone. But I knew it couldn't. Pete's justice had been served, and Uncle Roy would spend eternity guarding the grave of the man his family had murdered, conscious and aware, but unable to move or speak or die. Daddy inherited the farm, but he never asked too many questions about why Uncle Roy had disappeared. The official story was that Roy had probably fallen into one of the old mine shafts that dotted the hillsides around the property. Accidents like that weren't uncommon in mountain country. The sheriff came out and took a statement, poked around the property for a few days, but didn't find anything conclusive. Mountain people have always been good at keeping their secrets. We stayed through the harvest, and Daddy learned things about running a tobacco farm that Uncle Roy had never had the chance to teach him. The crop that year was the best anyone could remember. The tobacco around where Pete had stood grew thick and rich, bringing top dollar at the market. But Daddy made sure every cent of profit went to the families in town whose ancestors had been poisoned during the Depression. He said it was back taxes, money that had been owed for decades and was finally being paid. We moved back to town before winter set in, and Daddy found work at a different mill that had opened up in the next county. But he kept the farm, hiring local men to work it and continuing to use the profits to help people in the community. He never said why, but I knew he understood what Pete's ghost had told him without words. That blood debts echo through generations until someone makes them right. I'm 34 now, married with kids of my own, but I still think about that autumn on Uncle Roy's farm more than I probably should. Sometimes, when I'm driving through Madison County with my children, I'll take the old road past the tobacco fields. The farm's been sold to someone else now. Daddy finally let it go when he got too old to oversee the work. But the new owners kept the scarecrow in the center field. Old Pete, or what used to be Uncle Roy, is still standing guard out there. His wooden eyes follow my car as I drive past, and I know he recognizes me. I know he remembers the 2-year-old girl who helped free the spirit that condemned him to an eternity of aware imprisonment, and I know that those eyes are pleading for the same mercy I once showed to another trapped soul. But Pete is at peace now, and Uncle Roy's debt is his own to pay. Some nights, I think about going back with a shovel, about giving Uncle Roy the same release I gave to Pete. But then I remember the children who died eating sawdust, the families who trusted a man who poisoned them for profit, and I think maybe some debts are too big to forgive. My kids ask sometimes why I always take the long way around Madison County when we're heading to visit their cousins. I tell them it's because the mountain roads are prettier, which is true enough. But the real reason is that I can feel Uncle Roy watching from that field, still aware after all these years, still hoping someone will show him the same kindness I showed Pete. And honestly, I think that hope might be the worst part of his punishment. Because hope, when it goes on long enough without fulfillment, becomes its own kind of hell. I guess that's mountain justice for you. It's slow, but it's thorough, and it always balances the books eventually. The land remembers everything, and the mountains don't forgive easily. My daddy understood that, which is why he spent the rest of his life trying to make amends for sins he never committed. As for me, I sleep fine at night. I helped a murdered man find peace, and I think that matters more than the consequences that followed. Sometimes doing the right thing means other people pay the price, and you have to be able to live with that. But I've never gone back to Madison County after dark, and I never will. Because some places hold on to their ghosts too tightly to let them go, and some family debts run too deep to ever be fully paid. The mountains remember everything, and they're very, very patient. And Uncle Roy is still out there, watching over crops he can never harvest, guarding the grave of the man whose murder built his family's fortune. Conscious, aware, and counting every single day of an eternity that stretches out before him like a tobacco field with no end. I reckon that's justice enough. I'm 32 now, work as a data analyst for an insurance company in Richmond, but back in 1987, I was just a 15-year-old girl whose whole world got turned upside down when my daddy got hired as a mechanic at Morrison's Auto Repair in Welch, West Virginia. We'd been living in a cramped apartment in Beckley after Daddy lost his job at the coal prep plant, and honestly, the move felt like a blessing. Morrison's offered Daddy decent pay and even threw in a company house, a little 2-bedroom place that came fully furnished with old hand-me-downs from previous tenants. The house sat on the edge of town where the mountains started getting serious, surrounded by these massive oak trees that made the whole place feel like it was tucked away from the rest of the world. Most of the furniture was decent enough: a worn-out couch, kitchen table with mismatched chairs, beds that creaked but held our weight. But the thing that caught my attention right away was this old tube radio sitting on the kitchen counter. Had to be from the 1950 seconds, with that cream-colored plastic casing and a big round dial that clicked when you turned it. The previous tenant's family had left it behind, and Mama said we could keep it since they didn't want to bother hauling it away. Now, I was absolutely obsessed with music back then. This was 1987, and I was all about rock and roll, Bon Jovi, Def Leppard, anything with a good beat that made me feel like I was part of something bigger than our little mountain town. During the day, that old radio picked up the usual stations just fine. WCIR out of Beckley played decent classic rock, and WVOW had the newer stuff, though the signal got fuzzy depending on the weather. But I was one of those kids who couldn't sleep easy, especially in a new house, so I'd lay in bed at night fiddling with that radio dial, hunting for distant stations that came in clearer after dark. That's how radio waves work in the mountains. During the day, you get local stuff, but at night, the atmospheric conditions change, and you can pick up signals from hundreds of miles away. I'd caught stations from as far as Nashville and even Chicago on clear nights, which made me feel connected to the wider world beyond these hollers. It became my routine: finish homework, help Mama with dishes, then take that radio to my room and tune through the frequencies until I found something good. The first few weeks in Welch were pretty normal. Daddy seemed happy to have steady work again, even if it meant coming home with grease under his fingernails and smelling like motor oil. Mama got a job at the grocery store downtown, and I started at the local high school, which was small enough that everybody knew everybody else's business within about a week. I made friends with a girl named Lisa, whose daddy worked at the same garage, and for a while things felt stable in a way they hadn't in months. It was sometime in early October when I first found that frequency. I remember the date because it was the night before my first algebra test, and I was stressed about fitting in at the new school. I'd been tuning through the dial around 2 a.m., hitting mostly static with the occasional snippet of some far-off AM station when I landed on 88.3 FM. During the day, that frequency was nothing but dead air. But that night, I heard something that made me stop turning the dial. At first, it was just static, the kind of white noise that usually puts you to sleep. But then, slowly, like someone was adjusting the volume from another room, a voice started coming through. It was a man's voice, deep and smooth, with this strange quality that made it sound like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. The words weren't clear at first, just the rhythm of speech, the rise and fall of sentences, but something about it made me lean closer to the radio. "Welcome, children of the hollow," the voice said, crystal clear now. "This is your shepherd speaking, bringing light to the darkness that surrounds your troubled souls." I figured it was some late-night religious program, maybe broadcasting from one of those powerful stations down south. We got plenty of fire and brimstone preachers on the radio, especially late at night when the airwaves belonged to insomniacs and shift workers. But this voice was different somehow. It had this hypnotic quality, like honey mixed with something darker, and I found myself settling back against my pillow to listen. "I know you're out there, listening in the darkness," the preacher continued. "I know about the secrets you carry, the shame that keeps you awake when the rest of the world sleeps peacefully." That got my attention because, honestly, he was right. I did have secrets. Nothing terrible, just the usual teenage stuff about boys I had crushes on, little lies I'd told Mama, the way I sometimes felt angry at Daddy for losing his job and making us move. But the way this preacher said it, with such certainty, made my skin prickle. The show went on for what felt like hours, though I'm not sure exactly how long. He called it Children of the Hollow, and his whole thing seemed to be about knowing his listeners better than they knew themselves. He'd talk about forgiveness and redemption, but in this personal way that made it feel like he was speaking directly to whoever was tuned in. I found myself hanging on every word, even though part of me knew I should probably turn it off and get some sleep. When his voice finally started to fade with the static around dawn, I felt this strange disappointment, like something important had just ended. I tried to find the station again the next night, and there it was. Same time, same frequency, same impossibly knowing voice emerging from the white noise. It was the third night when things got personal. "Tommy Miller," the preacher said, his voice taking on a warmer, more intimate tone. "Sweet boy, I know you've been stealing from your mama's purse to buy those comic books. The guilt is eating at you, isn't it? My blood went cold. Tommy Miller was in my grade at school, a quiet kid who sat behind me in English class. I knew his family didn't have much money because his clothes were always a little too small and he never bought lunch in the cafeteria. But how could some random radio preacher know about him stealing money? And more importantly, how did he know Tommy was listening? Susan Davis, the voice continued, your lies about where you go after school are piling up like autumn leaves. Your parents think you're at cheerleading practice, but you're really meeting that older boy by the river, aren't you? Susan was a popular girl who'd been nice to me on my first day. She was a cheerleader, but I'd seen her walking toward the river road a couple times when practice should have been starting. Still, hearing her secrets broadcast over the radio made my stomach turn. This was private stuff, the kind of things people only knew if they were watching, really watching. Night after night, the preacher would call out names, kids from school, people from town, even adults whose business somehow wasn't as private as they thought. He knew about affairs, about drinking problems, about family fights that happened behind closed doors. And each time he spoke someone's name, his voice would get softer, more caring, like he was reaching through the radio to offer comfort. I started looking forward to those late-night sessions with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. I'd fake being asleep when Mama checked on me, then slip the radio under my blanket and tune to 88.3 as soon as the clock hit 2 a.m. The preacher's voice became the most important part of my day, even though I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole thing was fundamentally wrong. Then came the night he called my name. Rebecca, he said, and my whole body went rigid. Sweet Rebecca, I know about your daddy's drinking. The room suddenly felt too small, too hot. Nobody knew about that. Daddy had started hitting the bottle again after we moved to Welch, but he was careful about it. He'd stop at the liquor store on his way home from work and keep a bottle hidden in his toolbox in the garage. Mama didn't know because he'd brush his teeth and chew gum before coming inside. I only knew because I'd seen him out there one evening when I was taking out the trash. I see the worry in your young heart, the preacher continued, his voice somehow even gentler than before. The fear that he'll lose this job too, that your family will have to move again, start over in another place where nobody knows your name. Tears started rolling down my cheeks because he was right about everything. I was terrified that Daddy's drinking would ruin this new start, that we'd end up back in some crappy apartment with no future and no hope. But I can help you, dear child, the preacher said. I can take away all your family's troubles, all the pain and uncertainty that keeps you awake at night. You just have to trust me. Let my voice wash over your troubled mind. That night marked the beginning of what I can only describe as an addiction. I became completely dependent on hearing that voice every night, on feeling like someone in the world understood my problems and cared enough to help. The preacher never asked for money or told me to do anything specific. He just wanted me to keep listening, to let him be the voice that guided me through the darkness. My grades started slipping because I was staying up until dawn every night, hanging on every word of his sermons. I stopped hanging out with Lisa and the other friends I'd made, claiming I was too tired or too busy with homework. Food lost its taste, and I started losing weight because eating felt like a waste of time that could be spent thinking about what the preacher had said the night before. Mama noticed the changes, of course. She started asking questions about why I looked so tired all the time, why I was picking at my dinner, why I seemed distant and distracted. I made up excuses about schoolwork and adjusting to the new town, but I could see the worry growing in her eyes. The dream started around the same time. I'd finally fall asleep as the sun was coming up, and I'd find myself in this place that felt like an old church, but wrong somehow. The pews were there, but they stretched back further than any real building could hold, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move on their own. And standing at the front, behind a pulpit that looked carved from black stone, was a tall figure in dark robes. His face was always hidden in shadow, but his voice was exactly the same as the one that came through the radio. In the dreams, I could see other kids sitting in those endless rows of pews, pale, hollow-eyed children who stared straight ahead without blinking. They looked familiar, some of them, like faces I might have seen around town or school, but their expressions were completely empty, like someone had scooped out everything that made them human. "Welcome to the congregation," the preacher would say, his shadowed face turning toward me. "Here you'll find the peace you've been searching for, child. No more worry, no more fear, No more pain of living in a world that doesn't understand your suffering. I'd try to move, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. And the strangest part was that some part of me didn't want to run. The idea of sitting in those pews forever, just listening to that hypnotic voice without having to think or worry or feel anything else, started to seem appealing. When I'd wake up, usually late in the afternoon with Mama calling me for dinner, I'd feel this crushing disappointment that it had only been a dream. The real world felt harsh and loud and complicated compared to the quiet certainty of that dark church. As October turned to November, I could feel myself slipping away from my real life. I stopped caring about algebra tests or weekend plans or whether the popular kids liked me. The only thing that mattered was getting through each day so I could return to that frequency at 2 a.m. and let the preacher's voice fill up all the empty spaces in my head. That's when Mama tried to intervene. She came into my room one evening while I was pretending to do homework, really just counting down the minutes until 2 a.m. She sat on the edge of my bed with that serious expression she got when she was about to have what she called a heart-to-heart. "Honey, I'm worried about you," she said, reaching over to brush the hair out of my eyes. "You're not yourself lately. You're tired all the time, you're not eating enough, and you seem like you're a million miles away even when you're sitting right here with us." I mumbled something about school being stressful and tried to avoid eye contact, but Mama wasn't buying it. "Is it the radio?" she asked, nodding toward the old tube radio sitting on my desk. "I hear it playing late at night sometimes when I get up to use the bathroom. Are you staying up too late listening to music?" The idea of her taking away my connection to the preacher sent a bolt of panic through my chest. "It's not too loud, is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "I can turn it down." "It's not about the volume, sweetheart. It's about you needing your sleep. You're 15 years old. Your body and brain need rest to grow properly." She reached over and unplugged the radio from the wall. "Let's try putting this in the living room for a while, see if that helps you get better sleep." The moment her hand touched that radio, something inside me snapped. I lunged forward and grabbed it away from her, clutching it against my chest like she was trying to steal something precious. "No," I shouted, louder than I'd meant to. "You can't take it. I need it." The look of shock on Mama's face should have brought me back to my senses, but all I could think about was missing that night's broadcast, missing the preacher's voice calling out to me specifically. I held the radio tighter and backed away from her. "Rebecca, what on earth has gotten into you?" Mama asked, standing up with her hands raised like she was trying to calm down a wild animal. "It's just a radio, honey. There are others in the house if you want to listen to music." "You don't understand," I said, and I could hear how desperate I sounded. "This one is special. It picks up stations the others can't get." Mama's expression shifted from shock to something that looked like fear. "Sweetie, you're scaring me. It's just an old radio that someone left behind. There's nothing special about it." But there was something special about it. I was sure of that now. The preacher had chosen me, had spoken to me personally, had offered to solve all our family's problems. And Mama was trying to take that away because she didn't understand how important it was. That night, I barricaded my door with my desk chair and waited for 2 a.m. with the radio clutched in my lap. When the preacher's voice emerged from the static, it sounded different, colder, more demanding than the warm, caring tone I'd grown used to. "Rebecca," he said, "you're resisting the call. This disappoints me greatly." My stomach dropped. I'd made him angry somehow, and the last thing I wanted was to lose his approval. "I can sense the interference around you, child. Someone is trying to break the connection between us, to keep you from receiving the peace I'm offering." His voice took on a sharp edge that made me shiver. "This kind of obstruction requires consequences." "What do you mean?" I whispered to the radio, even though I'd never tried talking back to it before. "Your family will learn what happens when they stand between a shepherd and his flock." "The point," preacher said. "Perhaps when they see the price of interference, they'll understand the importance of letting you answer the call." The next morning, Daddy didn't come home from work at his usual time. When Mama called Morrison's auto repair, they told her Daddy had shown up drunk and they'd had to let him go immediately. He came home around noon, reeking of whiskey and shame, and told us through tears that he'd screwed up everything again. That same day, Mama started feeling sick. Not flu sick, but something stranger. She'd get dizzy spells that came out of nowhere, and her hands would shake for no reason. When we took her to the doctor, he ran all kinds of tests but couldn't find anything wrong with her. Probably just stress, he said, but Mama had never been the type to get sick from worry before. I knew the truth, though. The preacher was punishing them for Mama's attempt to take away the radio. He was showing me what happened when people tried to interfere with our connection. And as terrible as it sounds, part of me felt satisfied that Mama was learning not to mess with things she didn't understand. But I also felt guilty enough that I called my friend Lisa and asked her to come over. I needed someone else to know what was happening, even if I couldn't explain it in a way that made sense. "You're going to think I'm crazy?" I told Lisa as we sat on my bed that evening, "but I need you to listen to something with me tonight." I explained about the late-night radio show, about the preacher who seemed to know things about people in town that he shouldn't know. I didn't mention the dreams or the feelings I'd been having, just the basic facts about the strange broadcast. Lisa was skeptical, naturally. "Rebecca, that sounds like one of those syndicated shows they play on a bunch of different stations. The guy probably does research on the towns where his show airs, gets local information somehow." "It's not like that," I insisted. "He knows things that just happened, personal things that nobody else could know." "Okay," Lisa said, clearly humoring me. "We'll listen together tonight and see what this guy says. But I bet it's just some creepy radio preacher who's good at making people think he's psychic." We stayed up playing cards and talking until 2 a.m. Then I tuned the radio to 88.3. At first, there was only static, just like always, and I could see Lisa getting ready to say, "I told you so." But then the preacher's voice emerged, clearer than it had ever been. "Welcome, children of the Hollow," he said in that familiar, hypnotic tone. "Tonight we have a special guest in our congregation." Lisa's eyes widened, but before she could say anything, another voice joined the preacher's. A younger voice, one that made my blood turn to ice water. "Hi, Rebecca," the second voice said. "It's me, Bobby." Bobby Henderson had been in my grade back in Beckley before we moved to Welch. He'd been a quiet, artistic kid who always seemed a little sad, and his family had supposedly moved away over the summer. But hearing his voice coming through that radio, I realized the truth was much worse than I'd been told. "Tell her how wonderful it is here, Bobby," the preacher encouraged. "It's amazing, Rebecca," Bobby's voice said, but it sounded hollow and distant, like an echo from the bottom of a deep cave. "No pain, no worry, no pressure from parents or teachers or anyone else, just peace. Just listening to his voice forever and ever." Lisa screamed and bolted from the room, but I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sound of Bobby's voice, by the dreamy contentment in his words, even though something about the way he spoke made my skin crawl. "Bobby was my first local recruit," the preacher explained after Lisa's footsteps disappeared down the hall. "His family thought he'd run away, poor things. They never knew he'd simply found a better place to belong." "What happened to?" I whispered. "He found peace in my frequency, just as you will, my dear child," the preacher said. "He let go of the pain of living in a world that didn't understand him, and now he's part of something much larger and more meaningful." The horrible realization hit me then. Bobby hadn't moved away. His family had been lying, probably to themselves as much as to everyone else. He'd disappeared, and somehow this thing speaking through the radio had taken him. "Tomorrow night," the preacher continued, "you'll join us properly. The interference has been dealt with, and now you're free to accept the gift I'm offering." When the voice faded with the dawn, I sat staring at the radio for a long time, finally understanding what I'd been dealing with. This wasn't just some creepy preacher with insider knowledge about the town. This was something that collected children, something that fed on young souls and trapped them in whatever dark place Bobby's voice was coming from. I knew I had to destroy the radio, but I was terrified of what would happen if I did. The preacher had already punished my family for Mama's interference. What would he do if I cut off our connection completely? But I couldn't let him have me the way he'd had Bobby. I couldn't disappear and leave Mama and Daddy wondering what had happened to their daughter. That afternoon, while Mama was at the grocery store and Daddy was passed out on the couch, I carried the radio out to the backyard and smashed it with his baseball bat. The tubes shattered and the wires scattered across the grass, but even as I destroyed it, I could hear the preacher's voice coming from the broken pieces. "You can't destroy the frequency, Rebecca. his voice said, somehow still clear despite the radio being in ruins. I'm in the air around you now, in every electronic device that touches your life. And he was right. That evening, his voice started coming through the television during the evening news. When Mama tried to call her sister, the preacher's sermon was playing on the phone line instead of a dial tone. Even Daddy's truck radio, which had been broken for months, suddenly crackled to life with that familiar, hypnotic voice. Children of the Hollow, the preacher called from every speaker in our house. It's time to come home. I realized then that smashing the radio hadn't stopped anything. It had just made him angry enough to drop any pretense of subtlety. He was coming for me directly now, and there was nowhere I could go to escape his voice. That night, at exactly 2 a.m., I walked out to the living room, where the television was broadcasting his sermon to an empty room. I could feel my family's pain all around me. Daddy's shame about losing another job, Mama's fear about her mysterious illness, the way our whole household was falling apart because of my connection to this thing. I know you can hear me, I said to the television screen, where the preacher's shadow-faced figure was delivering his sermon to those empty-eyed children. Take me instead of my family. Leave them alone. Such a thoughtful child, the preacher's voice replied, warmer now, approving. Yes, that's exactly the kind of sacrifice that pleases me most. I sat down on the couch and closed my eyes, letting his voice wash over me one final time. I could feel myself starting to drift away, like falling asleep but deeper, more permanent. The last thing I remember was a sense of relief that Mama and Daddy would be safe, that their daughter's strange problems would finally be over. I woke up the next morning on the couch, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. Mama was shaking my shoulder gently, saying something about breakfast being ready, but I couldn't remember her name or mine, or why this stranger seemed so concerned about me. The television was off, and there was no sound in the house except normal morning noises. Coffee percolating, birds singing outside, the distant sound of Daddy's truck starting up. It took most of that day for my memories to come back, piece by piece, like puzzle pieces falling into place. By evening, I remembered my name and my family, but everything about the radio and the preacher felt distant and dreamlike, like something that had happened to someone else. The electronic devices in our house went back to working normally. Daddy got his job back when his boss decided to give him a second chance. Mama's mysterious illness disappeared as suddenly as it had started, and I never heard that voice again, no matter what frequency I tuned to. Looking back now, 25 years later, I'm still not entirely sure what happened to me that autumn in Welch. Sometimes I wonder if I really did sacrifice something to save my family, if some part of me is still trapped in that dark frequency somewhere. Other times I think maybe the stress of moving and Daddy's drinking just made me have some kind of breakdown, and the rest was my teenage mind, trying to make sense of psychological trauma. But I know Bobby Henderson never came home, and I know his family moved away from Beckley shortly after we did, probably unable to bear living in the place where their son had vanished. And sometimes, late at night when I'm having trouble sleeping, I can swear I hear a faint whisper of static in the air around me, like there's still something out there trying to tune in. I don't listen to the radio much anymore. I stream music on my phone or play CDs, anything that doesn't involve scanning through frequencies and wondering what might be waiting in the spaces between stations. And I've never told this story to anyone before, not even my husband, because I know how it sounds. But if you have teenage kids and they start staying up all night listening to voices that seem too personal, too knowing, too interested in the secrets they carry, maybe pay attention, maybe ask questions, maybe take the radio away, even if they fight you about it. Because some frequencies aren't meant for human ears, and some voices calling from the darkness aren't trying to help at all. I was 10 when we moved to Sourwood Holler, a narrow valley that cuts deep into the mountains of eastern Kentucky like a scar. My name's David, and I'm 32 now, married with 2 kids of my own, but I still think about those pale children almost every day. What happened in that holler changed everything about how I see the world, and honestly, I don't talk about it much because people look at you funny when you tell them stuff like this. But maybe someone needs to hear it. Maybe someone else has seen what I saw and wondered if they were losing their mind. Back in October of 2002, my mama got a new job assignment through the county health department. She'd been working as a home health nurse for about 15 years by then, driving all over 3 counties to check on elderly folks who couldn't make it to town for medical care. When the position in the Eastern Mountain District opened up, they offered it to her because she had experience with the more isolated communities, and the pay was better than her old route. Lord knows we needed the money. Daddy had left us that spring, and Mama was doing her best to keep us afloat on her own. The county provided housing for the position, a little white ranch house at the mouth of Sorewood Holler that had been built maybe 10 years earlier by some family from Lexington who thought they wanted to get back to the land. They'd lasted about 2 years before selling it cheap to the county, who used it as temporary housing for visiting nurses and social workers. It came furnished with basic stuff: a couch, kitchen table, beds, all the necessities, which was perfect since we'd had to leave most of our furniture behind when Daddy took off. Sorewood Holler itself was this narrow valley that snaked back into the mountains for about 3 miles before dead-ending at a wall of limestone cliffs. The old-timers called it a holler, but really it was more like a deep cut in the earth, with steep ridges rising up on both sides, covered in oak and hickory trees that turned beautiful colors in the fall. Our house sat right where the county road ended and an old gravel track began, putting us at the gateway to what felt like another world entirely. Past our house, scattered along both sides of that gravel track, were maybe a dozen old homesteads in various stages of decay. Some still had decent roofs and most of their walls, others were just stone foundations and chimneys with kudzu vines taking over everything else. Mama said most of these places had been abandoned since the coal company pulled out in the late 60s, when the families either moved to town looking for work or packed up and headed north to Detroit and Cleveland like so many mountain folks did back then. The thing about those empty houses was they didn't look completely dead, if that makes sense. Someone had been keeping the worst of the weeds cut back, keeping the yards from going completely wild. From our front porch, I could see into the yards of at least 5 or 6 of the old places. And while they were obviously abandoned, they weren't the kind of overgrown mess you'd expect after 40 years of nobody living there. I asked Mama about it when we first moved in, figured maybe there was a caretaker or something, but she said the county didn't have money for that kind of maintenance. When she asked around town, nobody seemed to know who was keeping those properties clear. Probably just folks being neighborly, old Mr. Henderson at the general store told her, but even he looked puzzled when she described how neat the yards were. I started 5th grade at the consolidated school in town, which meant a 40-minute bus ride each way down the mountain on roads that twisted and turned like a snake. The bus only came partway up the holler. Driver wouldn't take it all the way to our house because he said the turnaround was too tight, so I had to walk the last quarter mile every afternoon. Mama would usually be gone by the time I got home, making her rounds to check on the elderly folks scattered throughout the hollows and ridges in our district. Her main patient was Mrs. Hensley, who lived at the far end of Sourwood Holler about 2 miles back from our house. 93 years old, diabetic, lived alone in the same log house her great-grandfather had built back in the 1892. Sweet old lady, but stubborn as a mule about leaving her mountain. She'd been born in that house and planned to die in it, and no amount of reasoning from social workers or family members was going to change her mind. Those first few weeks in the holler were actually kind of peaceful. The quiet was different from anything I'd experienced growing up in town. No traffic noise, no neighbors arguing, no constant hum of civilization. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, maybe a dog barking somewhere way off in the distance, and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The air smelled cleaner too, like it had been washed by rain and filtered through miles of forest. I'd sit on our front porch doing homework in the afternoons, and sometimes I'd see deer grazing in the overgrown gardens of the abandoned houses. Wild turkeys would scratch around in the yards, and once I saw a red fox trotting down the gravel track like he owned the place. It felt safe and isolated in a good way, like we'd found our own little corner of the world where nothing bad could reach us. That's when I first noticed the children playing in the yards of the empty houses. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October, probably around 4 o'clock, and I was working on some math problems when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked up and saw them in the yard of the old Morrison place, which was maybe 150 yards up the holler from our house. At first glance, they just looked like normal kids having fun outside after school, just like I was trying to do with my homework on the porch. There were 5 of them, looked to be around my age or maybe a little younger, and they were playing some kind of circle game. They held hands and moved around in a perfect ring, like Ring Around the Rosie, but without the falling down part. I remember thinking it was nice to see other kids in the holler, made the place feel less lonely and isolated. So I waved at them, just being friendly like Mama had always taught me to be with neighbors. All 5 of them stopped their game at the exact same moment and turned to look at me. Then they waved back, all of them raising their hands at precisely the same time and moving them in identical gestures. I thought it was kind of strange, but kids do weird things sometimes when they're playing group games. I went back to my homework and didn't think much more about it, but I started noticing them every day after that. Always around the same time, always in the same spot, always playing that same silent circle game. They wore clothes that looked old-fashioned and handmade. The boys in faded overalls and plain work shirts, the girls in long dresses with aprons tied around their waists, the kind of clothes you'd see in old family photographs from 50 or 60 years ago. What struck me most about them was how pale they were. Not just light-skinned pale, but almost translucent, like they spent all their time indoors and never saw any sun. Their hair was pale too. The boys had white blonde crew cuts that looked like they'd been trimmed with a bull, and the girls had long, almost silver hair done up in neat braids. They were always perfectly clean too, which seems strange for kids playing outside. You know how children get dirty just by existing, especially when they're running around in old yards full of dirt and fallen leaves. I tried asking Mama about them when she got home from work that first week. Whose kids are those playing up at the Morrison place? I asked over supper. She looked confused and said there weren't any families with children living in the holler anymore, just old Mrs. Hensley at the far end, and she definitely didn't have any grandchildren visiting. When I described the children I'd been seeing, Mama got this worried expression on her face and said maybe they were kids from one of the other hollows who were walking over to play in the abandoned yards. You stay close to the house when I'm not home, she told me. If there are children around that I don't know about, I want to be able to keep an eye on things. But they weren't threatening or anything, just different. The main thing that bothered me was how quiet they were. I never heard them laughing or calling out to each other, even when they seemed to be having fun with their games. Their play was completely silent, like they were performing some kind of elaborate mime routine that only they understood. And they never seemed to get tired or bored like normal kids would. Most children would play for a while, then wander off to do something else or go inside for a snack. But these 5 would play their circle game for hours without stopping. They moved with this strange precision, like dancers who had rehearsed their routine until every step was perfect. The more I watched them over the next couple of weeks, the more details I noticed that didn't quite make sense. When they turned their heads, they all turned at exactly the same angle. When they raised their hands, they all raised them to exactly the same height. It was like watching 5 marionettes being controlled by the same puppet master. And their eyes, from my porch, I couldn't make out much detail about their faces, but their eyes seemed unusually large for their heads. Dark eyes that seemed to take up too much space, though I couldn't tell what color they were from that distance. After about 2 weeks of seeing them every afternoon, my curiosity finally got the better of me. I was lonely. If I'm being honest, the bus ride to school was long. I didn't really know any of the kids in my class yet, and spending every afternoon alone on the porch was getting old. Having some friends nearby, even strange, quiet ones, seemed better than no friends at all. So, on a Friday afternoon, as soon as I saw them start their circle game, I set down my homework and walked off our porch toward the Morrison place. The children saw me coming, of course. They stopped their game and stood perfectly still, all 5 of them turning to watch me approach with identical expressions of what looked like curiosity. As I got closer, maybe 50 yards away, I could see their faces more clearly. That's when I realized something was very, very wrong with what I was looking at. Their eyes weren't just large, they were completely black. No whites, no irises, no pupils, just solid black from edge to edge like pools of motor oil. And their skin wasn't just pale, it was almost transparent. I could see dark veins underneath, like looking at white tissue paper with ink drawings beneath it. Their mouths were wrong too, stretching almost from ear to ear even when they weren't smiling, giving them this perpetual grin that made my stomach twist. But the worst part was how they started moving toward me. All 5 of them began walking in my direction at the exact same time. their feet hitting the gravel in perfect synchronization. They didn't make any sound when they walked, no crunch of leaves, no scrape of shoes on stone, nothing. It was like they weighed nothing at all, or like they were floating just slightly above the ground. I stood there, frozen for maybe 10 seconds, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. These things looked like children from a distance, but up close they were obviously something else entirely. Something that had studied human children and learned to imitate them, but had gotten the details wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. Then my survival instincts kicked in and I ran. I ran back to our house faster than I'd ever run in my life, burst through the front door, and locked it behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and my hands were shaking as I pulled all the curtains closed. I spent the rest of the afternoon hiding in my bedroom, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. When Mama got home that evening, I told her everything. About the children that weren't really children, about their black eyes and synchronized movements, about how they'd started walking toward me like some kind of hunting pack. I expected her to tell me I was letting my imagination run wild, or that I'd just been scared by some local kids playing a prank. Instead, she got really quiet and made a phone call. I could hear her in the kitchen, keeping her voice low, but I caught fragments of what she was saying. Same description, she said. Black eyes, moving together. She was talking to someone who knew about this, someone who'd heard these details before. When she hung up, she came and sat down next to me on the living room couch. That was Mrs. Patterson from over in Letcher County, she said. She's been a home health nurse for 30 years, longer than I have, and she knows about those children you saw. Says they've been spotted in Sorewood Holler for decades. Always the same 5, always playing the same games. Mrs. Patterson had told Mama the story that local nurses and social workers knew but didn't talk about much. Back in September of 1965, a family named Morrison had been living in the house where I'd seen the pale children playing. Parents and 3 kids, plus 2 young cousins who were staying with them while their own parents looked for work up north. One night, all 5 children died in their sleep from carbon monoxide poisoning. Old propane heater in the front room had a bad connection, leaked gas all night while the family slept. The parents survived, because their bedroom was upstairs and had a window cracked open. But they woke up to find all 5 children dead in the living room where they'd been sleeping on pallets. The thing was, according to Mrs. Patterson, the pale children that people had been seeing weren't the ghosts of those Morrison kids. The real children had been dark-haired and suntanned from playing outside all summer. What people saw in that yard were something else entirely, something that had maybe been drawn by the tragedy or had been there all along just waiting for the right opportunity. Mrs. Patterson says they feed on childhood innocence, Mama told me, her voice barely above a whisper. They watch human children, study their behavior, try to learn what makes them tick. And if they watch long enough, they can start to replace them. She told me that over the years, 3 families in the area had reported losing children to whatever lived in Sorewood Holler. Kids would start playing with the pale ones, spending more and more time away from home. Gradually, the human children would begin to change, getting paler, quieter, more obedient. Their movements would become more synchronized with their strange playmates. Eventually, the real children would disappear entirely, replaced by perfect copies that looked right but felt fundamentally wrong to anyone who knew them well. The next Monday afternoon, when my bus dropped me off and I walked up the gravel track to our house, the pale children were playing directly across from our front porch. They'd never been that close before, always stayed up near the Morrison place, a safe distance away. But now they had arranged themselves in their circle so they were facing our house directly, facing the exact spot where I usually sat to do my homework. When I looked out through the living room window, all 5 of them turned to stare back at me and started waving. But it wasn't the casual, friendly wave I'd seen before. This was slow and deliberate, like they were performing some kind of ritual or casting a spell. Their black eyes were fixed on me, and those 2 wide mouths were stretched in identical smiles that made my blood run cold. I felt something pulling at me when I watched them wave. Not physically, but mentally, like they were calling to me without using words. The feeling was warm and pleasant, like the promise of friendship and acceptance and belonging. For a moment, I actually wanted to go outside and join their circle, to learn their silent games and become part of their perfect, synchronized world. That's when I understood just how dangerous they really were. For the next 3 weeks, they played in our yard every single afternoon. They would show up around 3:30, just before my bus was due to arrive, and they would stay until after sunset. Always in that same circle formation. Always facing the house, always watching and waving with those hypnotic, ritualistic gestures. Mama started picking me up from school instead of letting me ride the bus home. She didn't want me walking up that gravel track alone with those things waiting for me. But even when she was home, even when we kept all the curtains pulled tight, I could feel them out there, watching, waiting, calling to me in ways I couldn't hear but somehow understood. The worst part was what started happening to me during those 3 weeks. I began to change, just like Mrs. Patterson had warned Mama about. My reflection in the bathroom mirror started looking different. My skin grew paler day by day, like the color was being slowly drained out of it. My eyes seemed larger and darker, taking up more space in my face than they should have. When I smiled, my mouth looked too wide, stretching toward my ears in a way that didn't look natural. Mama noticed the changes too. I caught her staring at me sometimes with this expression of horror and disbelief, like she was watching her son being replaced by something else right in front of her eyes. She started taking pictures of me every day, comparing them to older photos, documenting the transformation that was happening, whether I wanted it or not. The pale children weren't just trying to lure me outside anymore. They were somehow drawing me into their group from a distance, making me more like them, even though I never left the house when they were visible. By the end of those 3 weeks, I was moving differently, more smoothly, more deliberately, with the same eerie precision I'd seen in them. When Mama called my name, I would turn to face her with that same synchronized head movement that had first caught my attention about the pale children. That's when she decided we had to leave Sorewood Holler immediately. She called in sick to work on a Thursday morning, spent the entire day packing our belongings back into boxes and loading them into our old Honda Civic. She didn't give the county any notice, didn't try to find a replacement for her position, didn't even stop to say goodbye to Mrs. Hensley. She just wanted to get me away from whatever was happening in that holler before it was too late. As we drove away from Sorewood Holler for the last time that evening, I looked back through the rear window to see the pale children standing in a perfect line along the gravel track, watching our car disappear down the mountain. The last rays of sunlight were filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the abandoned homesteads, and for a moment everything looked almost peaceful and normal. But there were 6 pale children in that line now instead of 5, and the 6th one looked exactly like me, same height, same build, same clothes I'd been wearing that morning. It raised its hand and waved goodbye with my own gesture, wearing my face, but with those black, bottomless eyes and that too wide mouth stretched in a smile that would haunt my dreams for years to come. We stayed in a motel in town for a week, while Mama found us a new apartment and got a job with the city health department. We never talked directly about what had happened in Sorewood Holler, but I knew she was watching me carefully for months afterward, making sure the changes reversed themselves, making sure I was still really her son. They did reverse, gradually. My skin regained its normal color, my eyes went back to their regular size and shape, my movements became naturally clumsy again like a normal 10-year-old should be. But I never felt entirely the same after that. There was always this small part of me that felt disconnected from the rest of the world, like something important had been left behind in that narrow valley. I'm married now, got 2 kids of my own, a boy who's 8 and a girl who's 6. We live in Louisville, about as far from the mountains as you can get and still be in Kentucky. I work for the city dispatch office, take emergency calls, send help to people who need it. Normal job, normal life, normal family. But I never let my children play outside unsupervised, and I know how crazy that sounds in 2024. I've heard other parents complain about being overprotective, but they've never seen what I've seen. They've never felt the pull of something ancient and patient, something that watches human children the way a scientist watches lab rats, studying their behavior and learning to copy it perfectly. Sometimes I still wonder if the real me is trapped back there in Sorewood Holler, playing silent games in a perfect circle with 4 other stolen children, waiting for the next human child to come close enough to replace. The thing that waved goodbye with my hand might have been a better son than I ever was, more obedient, more polite, never giving Mama any trouble or worry. But it wouldn't have been me. And sometimes, late at night when I'm lying in bed next to my wife and listening to my own children breathing safely in their rooms down the hall, I think about all the parents who never knew the difference, who raised perfect, pale copies of their real children and never realized what they'd lost. To this day, I won't drive through eastern Kentucky if I can help it. And if I ever meet someone who mentions seeing unusually pale children playing in abandoned homesteads, children who move with unnatural precision and wave with synchronized gestures, I tell them the same thing I'm telling you now. Keep driving. Don't stop. Don't wave back. And whatever you do, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Because some things that look human are the furthest thing from it you can imagine. And the price of finding out the difference might be losing yourself forever. I was 13 when Daddy started his job maintaining bridges for the State Highway Department, and I wish to God I'd never gone with him that summer. I'm 31 now, and I still wake up some nights with the taste of rust and creek water in my mouth, feeling my bones, trying to remember how to stretch longer than they should. This happened back in 2006 when we moved to a little nowhere town called Millfield in West Virginia. Population maybe 800 if you counted the dogs. Daddy had been struggling to find steady work after the plant in Charleston closed down, and when the state offered him this bridge maintenance position, it seemed like a blessing. Good pay, benefits, and we could finally get out of the cramped apartment where the neighbors fought all night and the sirens never stopped. The house we rented was nothing special. White clapboard with a sagging front porch and paint that peeled off in your hands if you touched it wrong. But it sat on an acre of land with thick woods pressing right up against our backyard, and at night you could hear Painter's Creek running over the rocks like whispered conversations. Mama wasn't thrilled about the isolation, but she went along because Daddy was finally getting work that meant something to him. See, Daddy had always been handy. He could fix anything mechanical with enough time and the right tools. But construction work was spotty, and the foreman jobs never lasted long. This bridge position was different. Steady work, maintaining the old structures that connected the mountain communities. Most of the bridges on his route were built back in the 1932nd and 1942nd, when the government was trying to link every holler and gap so the coal trucks and logging equipment could get through. That first summer, Daddy would take me along when I wasn't helping Mama with the household chores. I liked riding in the state truck, listening to him explain how load distribution worked and why certain rivets were more important than others. He taught me to use basic tools, and I was good at carrying his equipment and handing him what he needed without being told. The work was mostly routine, checking for stress fractures, rust damage, loose bolts, making sure the drainage cleared properly after storms. Most of his assigned bridges were in decent shape considering their age. The state had done right by the communities over the years, keeping up with major repairs when the structures needed them. But there was one bridge that made Daddy uncomfortable in a way I'd never seen before. He never said anything direct about it, but I could tell by how he'd get quiet on the drive there, how he'd check his tools twice before getting out of the truck, how his hands would shake just a little when he was filling out the inspection forms. It was the bridge over Devil's Creek, way back in what the locals called the deepest holler in 3 counties. The structure was a narrow iron span built sometime in the late 1932nd, just wide enough for one car at a time. Rusted steel beams held up a wooden deck that groaned under the weight of even a small truck. The whole thing sat about 20 feet above Devil's Creek, which cut through a gorge so narrow and deep that sunlight barely reached the water, even at noon. But what struck me most about that place was the wrongness in the air. Even with the creek running fast below, there was a stillness that made your ears ring. No birds, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush on either side. Just the sound of water over rocks and the wind high above in the treetops, like the forest was holding its breath every time we arrived. The local folks avoided that bridge whenever they could manage it. They'd drive 10 extra miles around rather than cross it, especially after dark. When Daddy asked why at the diner in town, people would look away and mumble about the water being unlucky, or mention hearing voices calling from underneath. Mountain superstition, Daddy said, but I noticed he never dismissed their stories as completely as he tried to sound. It was our fourth visit to Devil's Creek that I first saw the bridge keeper, though I didn't know what it was then. I was helping Daddy check the tension cables when I happened to glance down through the steel grating. Standing in the shallow water directly under the center span was a tall figure in what looked like a long, dark coat. At first I thought maybe it was a homeless person who'd found shelter under the bridge, or someone fishing in the creek despite the locals' warnings about the water. But something about the way it stood bothered me immediately. Too straight, too perfectly still, like a scarecrow that had been placed there and forgotten. When a piece of rust flaked off from Daddy's work and fell toward the creek, landing in the water just a few feet away, the figure didn't react at all. Didn't even turn to look at the splash. "Daddy," I said, pointing down through the grating, "there's somebody down there." He looked where I was pointing, squinting into the shadows. "Where at?" "Right there, under the middle of the bridge. Can't you see them?" Daddy stared for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Just shadows and creek water playing tricks, son. These deep hollers mess with your eyes sometimes." But I could see it clear as day. And the longer I watched, the more wrong details I noticed. The coat it wore moved in ways that didn't match the slight breeze drifting through the holler. The fabric seemed to flow and shift even when the air was completely still, like it was made of something heavier than cloth but lighter than water. When the figure finally did move, turning its head slightly to look up at us, the motion was too smooth, too fluid for human joints. We finished the inspection and drove away, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. That night at dinner, I asked Daddy about it again, describing exactly where the figure had been standing and what it looked like. He got that uncomfortable expression he'd wear when he didn't want to discuss something, and told me that old hollers like Devil's Creek could make you see things that weren't there. "Light bounces strange down in those deep places," he said. "Shadows can look like all sorts of things if you stare too long." But I knew what I'd seen wasn't shadows. Every time we returned to Devil's Creek over the next few weeks, the figure was there, always in the exact same spot, always perfectly motionless until we were directly overhead, always watching our work with what I was beginning to recognize as genuine interest. I started paying closer attention during our visits, and the details I noticed made my stomach twist with unease. The figure's proportions were wrong in subtle ways. Its arms seemed too long for its torso, hanging down past where its knees should be, when it occasionally shifted position to get a better view of Daddy's work. It moved with joints that bent at angles that looked painful, impossible even. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it climbing the support beams with movements that were too quick and too smooth, like it weighed nothing at all despite its height. The thing, because I was starting to think of it as a thing rather than a person, seemed genuinely fascinated by Daddy's maintenance techniques. When he'd tighten bolts or replace corroded sections of the bridge structure, it would position itself to observe the work more clearly. It was studying him, I realized, learning from watching him repair and reinforce the bridge. One morning in late July, we were doing more extensive work on the eastern support when Daddy's favorite wrench slipped from his grip and fell through a gap in the decking. I heard it clang off the steel beams below before splashing into Devil's Creek. Daddy cursed under his breath. That wrench was part of a set his own father had given him when he started doing mechanical work, and it was perfectly balanced for the kind of precision repairs bridge maintenance required. "I'll get it," I told him before he could object. I climbed down the steep embankment to the creek bed, following the sound of running water to where the wrench had fallen. The creek was clearer than it looked from above, and I could see the tool lying on the rocky bottom in about 3 feet of water. I waded out carefully, the current stronger than I'd expected, and when I bent down to retrieve the wrench, I felt eyes on me. When I straightened up with Daddy's tool in my hand, the bridge keeper was standing less than 10 feet away. Up close, I could see that it definitely wasn't human, despite maintaining a roughly human shape. Its skin was gray and mottled, like wet concrete that had been mixed with moss and left to cure in a damp place for decades. The texture looked rough and porous, more like stone than living flesh. Its face was wrong in ways that made my eyes water to look at directly. Eyes set too far apart, positioned at slightly different heights on the skull. The mouth stretched too wide, extending almost to where ears should have been. And when it was closed, I could still see the outline of teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. But strangest of all, it didn't seem hostile. When it saw me standing there with Daddy's wrench, it actually nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that was disturbingly polite. Then it held out one of its hands, if you could call it a hand. The fingers were too long and had too many joints, but the gesture was unmistakably an offer to help. I should have screamed. I should have dropped the wrench and run back up to Daddy as fast as I could climb. But there was something about the bridge keeper's manner that suggested courtesy rather than threat. It wanted to help me return the tool to Daddy. I understood somehow. So I placed the wrench in its outstretched palm, and for just a moment our skin made contact. The bridge keeper's flesh felt like cold metal that had been wrapped in damp burlap. Not quite dead, but not alive in any way I could recognize. There was a texture underneath the surface that reminded me of machinery. Gears and pistons and cables, all held together by something that might have once been muscle, but had transformed into something else entirely. When it spoke, its voice was like grinding stone, like metal scraping against concrete. But somehow, I could understand the words. Bridge needs keeping, it said, and in that moment, I knew this creature had been maintaining the structure far longer than any human worker ever could. I took the wrench back, nodded my thanks, and climbed back up to where Daddy was working. When I handed him the tool, he looked puzzled. "Where'd you find it?" I was sure it fell into the deep water. "It was just sitting on a rock," I lied, not sure why I felt the need to protect the bridge keeper's secret. But over the rest of that summer, the bridge keeper began showing me things that no engineering manual could have taught. During our visits to Devil's Creek, it would emerge from the water and demonstrate techniques for maintaining the bridge that defied everything Daddy had learned about structural repair. It showed me how to feel stress points in metal by pressing my palms against the steel beams. The bridge would somehow communicate its condition directly through my fingertips. I could sense hairline cracks before they became visible, identify bolts that were about to fail, locate weak spots in the structure that hadn't yet shown symptoms. The bridge keeper taught me to listen to the subtle sounds metal made under different types of stress, to recognize the whisper of corrosion eating through iron, to feel the bridge's overall health like a pulse. But the techniques required something I didn't understand at first: direct contact, extended contact. The bridge keeper would place my hands on rusted sections and hold them there while something passed between the metal and my skin. At first it felt like mild electrical current, but as the lessons continued, the sensation became more intense, more invasive. Each time I used the bridge keeper's methods, I felt different afterward. My skin began taking on a grayish tint that Mama attributed to spending too much time outdoors without sunscreen. I started preferring dark, cool places over bright sunlight. The basement, the woods behind our house, anywhere the shadows were thick and the air felt heavy. Most noticeable was my growing disinterest in normal activities. Television shows seemed pointless. Video games felt like meaningless noise. Even conversations with kids my own age began to feel hollow and irritating. The only thing that held my attention anymore was the bridges and their maintenance. I found myself thinking about them, constantly, not just Devil's Creek, but every bridge in Daddy's territory. I could sense their conditions even when we weren't visiting them, like a dull ache in the back of my mind that told me when a structure needed attention. Daddy noticed the changes but couldn't make sense of what was happening to me. I tried explaining about the bridge keeper and the things it was teaching me, but he couldn't see it even when it was standing right beside us during our inspections. To him, I was just a kid who was getting unhealthily obsessed with his work. "You need to spend more time with boys your own age," he'd say. "This bridge business isn't everything." But he was wrong. I was beginning to understand that bridge keeping was the only thing that mattered. As August progressed, the physical changes accelerated. My skin continued to gray and toughen, developing a texture that felt more like stone than flesh. My bones began to ache constantly, a deep pain that felt like growing. Pains, but wrong, like my skeleton was trying to reshape itself into something it wasn't designed to become. My voice started developing a rougher quality, words scraping against my throat on their way out. But the worst part was what was happening to my mind. I was losing pieces of myself, memories, feelings, connections to the person I'd been before the summer started. I'd forget the names of classmates, lose track of conversations mid-sentence, find myself standing in rooms with no memory of why I'd gone there. It was like my human identity was being erased bit by bit to make room for something else. The bridge keeper explained what was happening during one of our final lessons. The mountains needed guardians who understood both human engineering and the ancient ways of maintaining the pathways between communities. Creatures like it had been doing this work for generations, but human development was destroying the wild spaces where they could exist, undetected. The old places of power were being paved over, subdivided, turned into shopping centers and housing developments. It needed someone to inherit its responsibilities, someone who could move between the human and supernatural worlds, who could maintain the bridges using both modern techniques and the older methods that kept structures functional long past their expected lifespans. The transformation had been gradual, designed to minimize the shock, but now it was accelerating toward completion. The change cannot be stopped, it told me, its grinding voice somehow gentle despite the harshness. You are becoming what the bridges require. I realized then what the pain in my bones had been. My skeleton was lengthening, joints adding extra pivot points to allow for the kind of movement bridge keeping required. My skin was hardening to withstand direct contact with corrosive metals. My nervous system was rewiring itself to interface with iron and steel the way other people interfaced with computers or musical instruments. But I was also losing my humanity piece by piece. The memories that made me who I was were fading, replaced by an encyclopedic knowledge of structural engineering and metallurgy that felt alien in my head. My emotional connections to family and friends were dissolving, becoming abstract concepts rather than felt experiences. I could remember loving my parents, but the feeling itself was disappearing like smoke. When school started in September, I found I could barely sit still in the classroom. The bridges were calling to me constantly now, a chorus of structural needs that drowned out everything else. I started skipping classes to visit the bridges on Daddy's route, performing maintenance work that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic failures. But each repair I completed using the bridge keeper's methods made me less human than I'd been before. By October, I could no longer pretend to be a normal teenager. My skin had turned completely gray, my limbs had lengthened beyond normal human proportions, and my voice had become the grinding rasp of stone against metal. Most importantly, I was becoming invisible to regular people. When my parents looked in my direction, their eyes would slide past as if I weren't there. Conversations I tried to join would continue as if I hadn't spoken. The bridge keeper explained that this was the final stage of the transformation. I was becoming something between human and whatever it had been, with responsibilities that extended far beyond Daddy's assigned route. Every bridge in 3 counties would become my responsibility, structures that required constant attention to remain safe for the travelers who depended on them. The night before my transformation completed, I stood in my childhood bedroom, looking at posters and books and clothes that belonged to a person I was no longer capable of being. I tried to feel sad about losing my human life, but the emotion wouldn't come. It was like trying to remember the taste of food you'd eaten years ago. You knew it had been important once, but the specifics were gone. When I woke up the next morning, the change was complete. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a creature that might have been human once but had become something else entirely. My parents couldn't see me anymore. When I spoke, they responded to empty air. I had become a bridge keeper, invisible to the world but essential to its function. Now I maintain every bridge in Daddy's old territory and several counties beyond. I can feel each structure's condition constantly, like monitoring the vital signs of dozens of patients simultaneously. I prevent rust before it can weaken critical supports, reinforce weak spots before winter ice can exploit them, repair stress fractures before they can spread. The bridges last decades longer than they should because of my work, keeping mountain communities connected when budget cuts would otherwise force them into isolation. But the cost was everything that made me human. I remember having a family, but I can't recall what it felt like to love them. I remember being excited about birthdays and Christmas, but the emotions are just concepts now, like reading about happiness in a textbook. I know I used to enjoy music and movies and talking with friends, but I can't access whatever part of me found those things meaningful. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working under a bridge in some remote holler, I catch glimpses of who I used to be. A sudden flash of what it felt like to laugh at a joke, or the memory of feeling proud when Daddy praised my work. But the moments pass quickly, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The old bridge keeper moved on once. I was fully capable of handling the responsibilities alone. Where it went, I don't know, and can't bring myself to care. But I understand now that this has always been the way. One, guardian training. Another, ensuring the mountain crossings never go unprotected, even as the cost of that protection consumes everything that made the guardian human. I still see Daddy sometimes when he's doing his state inspections. He can't see me, but I watch him work and make sure the bridges are in perfect condition when he arrives. Sometimes I think he senses my presence. He'll pause in his work and look around like he's heard something familiar, or he'll run his hand along a beam I've just repaired with an expression I can't quite read. The bridges I maintain never give him trouble anymore. They're always structurally sound, free of dangerous corrosion, properly reinforced against weather damage. I like to think that somewhere deep in his mind, he knows someone is looking out for him and the communities he serves. But I can't feel proud of that work the way I once would have. Pride, like love and joy and sadness, has become just a word for something other people experience. I maintain the bridges because it's what I am now, not because I choose to or find meaning in it. The transformation gave me purpose, but took away the ability to find satisfaction in fulfilling that purpose. To this day, I don't regret the choice I made, but that's only because regret requires an emotional capacity I no longer possess. The mountains needed a bridge keeper who understood both worlds, and I became exactly what they required. The cost was my humanity, but humanity was always temporary anyway. The bridges, and the need to maintain them, are eternal. I am what the bridges made me. And what the bridges made me was necessary, even if it was no longer human. I was 12 years old when my daddy got hired as a security guard at the old Black Rock strip mine, and honestly, I thought it was going to be the best thing that ever happened to us. We'd been living in this cramped apartment above Mrs. Henderson's grocery store in town ever since Mama left us the year before, and Daddy had been bouncing between construction jobs that never seemed to last more than a few months. When the mining company offered him steady work watching over their abandoned operation, it felt like we'd finally caught a break. The job came with a decent trailer right at the mine entrance, and Daddy said we'd have more space than we'd ever had before. I remember being excited about it. What 12-year-old wouldn't want to live next to a giant hole in the mountain where they used to blast rocks apart? The drive up to Black Rock took about an hour from town, winding through these narrow mountain roads that got steeper and more isolated the higher we climbed. Daddy explained that the mining company had shut down operations about 3 years earlier when copper prices dropped, but they still owned all the equipment and infrastructure up there. Apparently, they'd been having problems with thieves sneaking in to steal copper wire and scrap metal, so they decided to hire someone to live on site and keep an eye on things. It seemed like easy money to me. Just Daddy and me living up in the mountains, him making regular patrols during the day and keeping trespassers out at night. The company even gave him an old pickup truck to use for getting around the property and driving down to town for supplies when we needed them. When we first arrived at Black Rock, I couldn't believe how massive the strip mine actually was. I'd seen pictures of strip mining before, but seeing it in person was completely different. The operation had carved this enormous scar into the side of the mountain, creating these deep terraces that stepped down into the earth like some kind of giant staircase. Each terrace was probably 30 or 40 feet wide, and you could drive a truck along most of them without any trouble. The whole thing went down maybe 200 feet into the mountain, with exposed rock walls showing all these different colored layers of stone and mineral deposits. It was actually pretty beautiful in a weird, destructive kind of way, like someone had taken a bite out of the mountain and left behind this geometric wound. Our trailer was positioned right at the main entrance, next to the access road that led down to the terraces. It was bigger than anywhere we'd lived since Mama left, with 2 bedrooms, a decent kitchen, and a living room with windows that looked out over the mine. Daddy set up his security equipment in the living room, a CB radio for communicating with the mining company, binoculars for keeping an eye on the lower levels, and a logbook where he was supposed to record anything unusual. The company had also given him a flashlight that was about as bright as a car headlight and a set of keys to all the gates and equipment sheds scattered around the property. For the first few weeks, everything was exactly as routine as Daddy had expected. He'd do his patrols during the day, walking or driving around the different terrace levels to check for signs of trespassers or equipment damage. Most evenings, we'd sit on the front steps of the trailer and watch the sun set over the mine, and Daddy would tell me stories about what it must have been like when hundreds of workers were up here every day, blasting and hauling tons of rock. He seemed more relaxed than he'd been since Mama left, and I was starting to feel like maybe we'd finally found a place where we could be stable for a while. But Daddy had warned me from the very beginning that nights were when the real problems started. He said that's when people would try to sneak in and steal copper wire or scrap metal, because they figured no one would be around to catch them. The mining company had specifically told him that the overnight security was the most important part of his job, and that's why they were paying him enough to live on site full-time. What Daddy didn't tell me until later was that the previous security guard had quit after only 6 weeks, claiming that there was something living in the deepest parts of the mine that had been disturbed by all the blasting and excavation. The first time I heard about this, Daddy tried to play it off like the guy was probably just spooked by bears or maybe wild dogs that had started denning in the lower terraces. "You blast that much rock out of a mountain," he told me, "you're going to change the way animals move around up here. Probably just bears trying to figure out their new territory." But I noticed that when Daddy said this, his hand was shaking slightly as he lit his cigarette, and he kept glancing toward the mine entrance like he was expecting to see something moving down there. I think Daddy wanted to believe his own explanation about bears. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right about the place. During his first week on the job, he'd found these strange marks scratched into the rock walls of the lower terraces. Long, gouging scrapes that looked like they'd been made by something with claws, but the marks were too deep and too precisely spaced to have come from any animal I could think of. When he reported them to the mining company, they told him that blasting sometimes creates unusual rock formations and stress fractures, and not to worry about it unless he actually saw trespassers on the property. The first time I actually saw the thing that was living in the mine, I was helping Daddy with his evening patrol of the upper terraces. It was getting close to sunset, and Daddy wanted to check the equipment sheds one more time before dark. We were walking along the second terrace from the top, maybe 50 feet above, the deepest part of the excavation, when I noticed this shadow moving along the rock wall below us. At first, I thought it was just the way the light was hitting the stone as the sun got lower, but then I realized that this shadow was moving independently of any light source I could see. The thing was completely black and seemed to flow like liquid across the rock face, but it was moving with obvious intelligence and purpose. It would pause at certain sections of the wall, reaching out with what looked like appendages to touch and examine different areas of exposed stone. Its form kept shifting and changing as it moved, sometimes spreading wide like spilled paint, other times condensing into something that almost looked humanoid. But even when it took on a more human-like shape, everything about its proportions was wrong. Arms too long, legs bending in directions that didn't make sense, a head that seemed to tilt at impossible angles. When the creature noticed us watching, from above, it froze completely still for what felt like several minutes. I could feel it studying us, even though I couldn't make out anything that looked like eyes or a face. There was this intelligence behind its stillness that was absolutely terrifying, like it was learning from observing us, taking notes on how we moved and behaved. Then, without any warning, it began climbing straight up the vertical rock wall toward our position, moving like gravity didn't affect it at all. As it climbed, its form shifted and changed, growing arms and legs as needed, reshaping itself to navigate the rock face with impossible ease. What scared me most was how deliberate every movement seemed. This wasn't some mindless creature acting on instinct. It was problem-solving, adapting its body to overcome each obstacle as it encountered them. Daddy grabbed my shoulder and pulled me back from the edge of the terrace, and I could hear him breathing hard as we hurried toward the truck. "Don't let it see your face," Daddy whispered urgently as we walked quickly away from the mining pit. "Don't let it learn your shape." At the time, I didn't understand what he meant by that, but the fear in his voice was so genuine that I kept my head down and didn't look back toward the rock wall. We drove back to the trailer without talking, but I could see Daddy's hands shaking on the steering wheel, and he kept checking the rearview mirror like he expected to see something following us. That night, I heard something moving around our trailer in slow, deliberate circles. It sounded like wet concrete being dragged across gravel, this thick, sliding noise that would pause every few feet and then continue. I lay in my bed listening to it for what felt like hours, too scared to get up and look out the window. But eventually, my curiosity got the better of me, and I crept over to the window that faced the mine entrance. What I saw pressed against the glass was this formless black mass that seemed to be trying to understand the concept of windows. It was pushing against the glass with different parts of itself, testing how the transparent barrier worked, experimenting with different pressures and angles. As I watched, it began forming what looked like hands and pressing them against the window, but the handprints kept changing shape and size, like it was trying out different configurations to see what worked best. The creature seemed to be studying human architecture, learning how we built our shelters and organized our living spaces. It moved from window to window around the trailer, examining each one carefully, pressing against screens and testing door frames. I realized it was gathering information about how humans lived, what materials we used, how we protected ourselves from the outside world. The whole time, it maintained this patient, methodical approach that was somehow more frightening than if it had been trying to break in. When I woke up the next morning, those handprints were still on my bedroom window, but they had changed overnight. Instead of the shifting, experimental shapes I'd seen before, they were now perfect copies of my own hands, exactly the right size and proportion, complete with the distinctive scar I had on my left palm from when I'd cut myself on a fence the previous summer. The creature had been studying me specifically, learning to mimic my physical characteristics. Daddy found footprints around the trailer that told the same disturbing story. Near the back corner, the prints started as these formless puddle shapes, but as they circled the trailer, they gradually became more human-like. By the time the trail reached my bedroom window, they were perfect copies of my footprints, right down to the worn pattern on the soles of my sneakers. It was like watching evolution in fast forward, except this thing was evolving specifically to imitate me. "It's learning," Daddy said grimly as we examined the prints together. "Learning to be human by copying you." He explained that deep mining sometimes breaks into underground spaces that should stay sealed. Ancient caverns, where things had evolved differently, away from sunlight and the rules that governed life on the surface. The strip mining at Black Rock had apparently exposed one of these spaces, releasing something that had been isolated from our world for thousands of years. According to Daddy, the creature was trying to understand surface life by mimicking what it observed, but it didn't comprehend that humans were individuals with unique identities. To this thing, we were just shapes to be copied, patterns to be learned and reproduced. It didn't understand the difference between appearance and identity, between copying someone's form and actually becoming them. But it was learning fast, adapting its malleable body to match human anatomy and behavior. Each night, the creature came closer to the trailer, and its imitation of human form became more accurate. By the end of the first week, it could maintain a human silhouette for several minutes at a time. I would watch from my bedroom window as it practiced walking upright like a person, but its movements were still fundamentally wrong, too fluid, with joints bending in directions that human anatomy doesn't allow. It looked like someone trying to remember how to walk after suffering a severe brain injury, except this thing had never been human to begin with. The most disturbing part was how quickly it was improving. Every night, its human impersonation became more convincing, more accurate in its details. It learned to move with the right rhythm, to hold its head at natural angles, to swing its arms in coordination with its steps. But there were always these small details that gave it away. The way it would pause mid-step like it was remembering what came next, or how its limbs would sometimes flow into slightly different proportions between movements. One night, around 2 a.m., the creature knocked on our front door and spoke in a perfect copy of my voice. "Daddy, let me in," it said, sounding exactly like me, down to the slight lisp I had when I was nervous. I forgot my key again, but Daddy knew I was in my bedroom, and he'd taught me never to go outside after dark since we'd moved to the mine. The creature was testing whether it could fool him with its improved mimicry, seeing if it had learned enough about human family dynamics to manipulate our behavior. When Daddy didn't respond to the first attempt, the thing began cycling through different voices. Family members we'd left behind in town, friends from Daddy's previous jobs, even Mama's voice calling for help from somewhere in the darkness. It had been listening to us for weeks, recording and practicing human speech patterns, learning the emotional connections between different voices and identities. The creature understood that humans responded to familiar voices, but it didn't grasp the deeper relationships those voices represented. I lay in my bed, listening to this thing use Mama's voice to beg Daddy to open the door, and I could hear Daddy crying quietly in the living room. The creature had somehow learned Mama's exact tone and inflection, probably from overheard phone conversations or from Daddy talking about her. But hearing that voice coming from something that wasn't human, something that was trying to trick its way into our home, was more horrible than any monster could have been. The next morning, Daddy started packing our belongings without explanation. He called the mining company and told them he was quitting effective immediately, that there were family emergency and we had to leave right away. I could tell he was lying, but I also understood that we couldn't stay at Black Rock any longer. The creature was learning too quickly, becoming too good at pretending to be human. Soon, it might be able to fool Daddy, or worse, it might figure out how to replace one of us entirely. We loaded everything we could fit into Daddy's truck and drove away from the mine before noon. I watched through the rear window as the trailer and the strip mine disappeared behind us, and I thought I saw something dark moving along one of the lower terraces. But I couldn't be sure. Daddy drove fast on those winding mountain roads, faster than was probably safe, like he was worried something might be following us. That was 8 years ago, and we never went back to Black Rock. Daddy found work in a different town, and we eventually got a small house near some of Mama's relatives. But sometimes, usually when I'm not paying attention, I catch my reflection doing things I didn't do, moving slightly wrong, or blinking in patterns I don't remember making. My hands will be positioned in ways that don't feel natural, or I'll notice my posture is off in some subtle but disturbing way. I think part of that creature learned to copy me so well that it became part of me somehow. Like maybe when it was studying my movements and mannerisms, it left some kind of imprint that I carry around now. I've never told Daddy about these moments when my reflection seems to act independently, because I know it would just worry him. But sometimes I wonder if the thing at Black Rock is still learning, still practicing, still getting better at being human by using the connection it made with me all those years ago. To this day, I avoid strip mines and abandoned industrial sites. There's something about those places where humans have carved too deeply into the earth that makes me nervous, like we might have disturbed things that were better left alone. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that wet concrete sound moving around outside my house, circling slowly, patiently, like it's still trying to learn something important about the way I live. I was 9 years old when Mama sent me to live with Great Aunt Clarice down by the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. This was back in 1987, and Mama was going through what she called her difficult time, which really meant she was drinking too much and couldn't handle taking care of me anymore. I remember the drive down there, watching the mountains get bigger and the roads get narrower, until we finally pulled up to this little white house that sat right on the riverbank like it was growing out of the water itself. Aunt Clarice was Mama's aunt, technically, which made her my great aunt, though she always just told me to call her Aunt Clarice. She was probably in her 70s then, with silver hair she kept in a tight bun, and these sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. She'd been a school teacher for 40 years before retiring, and even though she was done with regular teaching, she still gave swimming lessons to kids from all over the area. Parents would drive from 3 counties away to bring their children to her, which seemed strange to me at first. I mean, there were plenty of places to learn how to swim that didn't require driving 2 hours into the mountains, but Aunt Clarice had a reputation. In 40 years of teaching kids to swim in that river, she'd never lost a single student, not one. That's what she'd tell the parents when they dropped their kids off. 40 years teaching children to swim, and the river's never taken one from me. She'd say it with this quiet pride, like it was the most important thing she'd ever accomplished in her life. The house itself was small but comfortable, with a screened-in porch that looked out over the water. The Greenbrier ran deep and fast right there, deeper than it looked from the bank. Aunt Clarice had this little dock that extended about 10 feet into the water, with a ladder on the end for getting in and out. She'd converted the basement into a changing area for the kids who came for lessons, with towels and basic first aid supplies and a little wood stove for when the weather turned cold. I settled into a routine pretty quickly. Mornings were for chores around the house, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, helping with the garden. Afternoons were for swimming lessons when kids came by, and I'd usually just sit on the porch and watch. Evenings were for supper and listening to Aunt Clarice tell stories about the old days, when the mountains were full of logging camps and the river carried timber down to the mills. The first thing I noticed about Aunt Clarice's swimming lessons was how calm the water got when the kids were in it. The Greenbrier was known for being unpredictable. Fast currents that could change direction without warning, deep holes that would suck you down, undertows that could drag a grown man under. But when those children were learning to float and do their basic strokes, the water would become as still and gentle as a pond. I thought it was just coincidence at first. Maybe she was just good at reading the river, knowing when conditions were safe for lessons. But then I started paying closer attention, and I noticed something else. Before each lesson, Aunt Clarice would walk down to the edge of the dock and kneel down, touching the water with her fingertips. She'd whisper something I couldn't quite hear, words that didn't sound like English. "Old river," she'd murmur. "Keep these children safe." And then she'd say other things in that strange language, her lips barely moving. The really weird part was how the river seemed to respond. I'd be watching from the porch, and I could see the current lines shift and change after she spoke to the water. Dangerous spots that had been churning and dark would suddenly become clear and calm. The water temperature would warm up noticeably, even on cool days. It was like the river was listening to her and actually doing what she asked. After I'd been there about 3 weeks, I was swimming well enough that Aunt Clarice let me venture into the deeper sections during my own practice time. I was getting confident, maybe a little cocky, when this family showed up from Charleston one afternoon. City folks in a fancy car, with twin boys who looked to be about 11 years old. Marcus and Michael, their names were. They had that attitude that city kids sometimes get when they come to the mountains, like everything here was backward and primitive, and they were doing us a favor by showing up. Their parents were the type who'd clearly never spent much time outdoors. The mother kept checking her phone even though there wasn't any cell service out there, and the father kept looking around like he was worried something was going to jump out of the woods at him. But they'd heard about Aunt Clarice's reputation, and they wanted their boys to learn proper swimming technique. Marcus was the more outspoken of the two, always making little jokes under his breath. When Aunt Clarice started explaining the basic safety rules, stay within the marked area, don't go past the deep line, always listen when she called them back. Marcus rolled his eyes and nudged his brother. "It's just water, lady," he said with this smirk. "We've been swimming in pools since we were 5. Aunt Clarice's expression didn't change, but I could see something tighten around her eyes. "This river's different from any pool," she said quietly. "It has its own ways, and we need to respect them." The boys just laughed. The lesson started normally enough. Aunt Clarice did her usual routine, kneeling by the water and whispering her words of protection. But I could tell something was off. The river didn't calm the way it usually did. The current kept shifting, like it was restless or agitated. The water stayed cooler than normal, and there were these little whirlpools that kept forming and disappearing near the dock. Both boys were decent swimmers, I'll give them that. But they kept pushing boundaries, swimming just a little farther out than they were supposed to, diving down deeper than Aunt Clarice had told them was safe. Every time she called them back, they'd comply for a few minutes, then gradually drift out again. "Boys," Aunt Clarice called, her voice carrying more urgency than usual. "Come back to the shallow water, now." But Marcus just waved her off and dove down deep, staying under for what felt like way too long. When he finally surfaced, he had this strange smile on his face, and his eyes looked different. They were reflecting the water's green color, like there was light coming from behind them. Michael followed his brother down and came up with the exact same expression. That's when I knew something was really wrong. Both boys started swimming in these perfect, synchronized circles, moving in patterns that didn't look quite human. They weren't responding when their parents called their names from shore, weren't even seeming to hear Aunt Clarice's increasingly frantic commands to come back to shallow water. They just kept circling, like they were following some kind of underwater choreography that only they could hear. Aunt Clarice waded out toward them, speaking urgently in that strange language I'd heard her use before. But this time her words sounded different, pleading instead of commanding. "River spirit," she said. loud enough now that I could hear her clearly. "They're just children. They meant no disrespect. Please." The boys' parents were screaming from the shore, but they were too terrified to enter the water themselves. I wanted to help, but something in Aunt Clarice's voice told me to stay put, that there were forces at work here that I didn't understand. I watched in horror as both twins slowly began to sink beneath the surface, still wearing those blank, eerily peaceful smiles. They weren't struggling or fighting. It was like they were being gently pulled down by invisible hands. Aunt Clarice dove after them without hesitation, disappearing into the dark water that had suddenly become murky and impossible to see through. For 15 of the longest minutes of my life, we saw nothing but ripples on the surface. The boy's mother was sobbing hysterically, and their father was pacing back and forth on the shore, shouting questions that nobody could answer. I just sat there on the dock, staring at the water and praying to anyone who might be listening. Then Aunt Clarice broke the surface, gasping and shaking, with both boys under her arms. All 3 of them were breathing, but barely. The twins looked normal again. No more green reflected in their eyes, no more eerie smiles. But they were crying and covered in these strange bruises that looked like handprints. Long, thin fingerprints that definitely didn't belong to any human I'd ever seen. "Something tried to pull us down," Marcus whispered, all his earlier cockiness completely gone. It felt like drowning hands grabbing at us. Aunt Clarice was checking them over carefully, and when she rolled up their pants legs, we could see bite marks around their ankles. Dozens of small, sharp punctures, too numerous and too small to be from any fish or turtle that lived in the river. They looked almost like teeth marks, but from something with a mouth full of needles. The family packed up and left within 10 minutes, the boys wrapped in blankets and shivering despite the warm afternoon. They didn't say goodbye, didn't say thank you, just loaded into their car and drove away like something was chasing them. I never saw them again. That evening, after the dust had settled and the sun was starting to set over the mountains, Aunt Clarice finally sat me down and explained what had really happened. What had been happening for decades. The Greenbrier River, she told me, was home to something much older than human memory. The Cherokee tribes, that had lived in these mountains before white settlers came, had called it Drowning Mother, an ancient spirit that dwelt in the deepest parts of the river and collected the souls of those who drowned in its waters. When the white settlers arrived and began using the river for transportation and industry, the spirit adapted, learning to feed on anyone who showed disrespect to the water. "I made a bargain with it 50 years ago," Aunt Clarice said, her voice heavy with sadness. "When I first started teaching children to swim here, the deal was simple," she explained. She would bring the spirit-respectful children who followed the rules and showed proper reverence for the water's power. In exchange, it would spare them and even protect them from the river's natural dangers. But the spirit demanded payment for this protection, and that payment was Aunt Clarice herself. "My time's almost up," she whispered, looking out at the water that was beginning to reflect the first stars. "The debt's been growing for decades, and the spirit's getting impatient." I spent the next month learning everything Aunt Clarice could teach me. Not just swimming techniques, but the ancient words of protection, the proper way to speak to the water spirit, the signs that indicated whether the river was in a mood to be generous or hungry. She taught me the exact phrases that would keep children safe and the rituals that needed to be performed before every lesson. The night before I was supposed to go back to Mama, Aunt Clarice walked out into the river alone. I watched from the porch as she waded deeper and deeper, speaking the old words one final time. This time she wasn't asking for protection for children. She was offering herself to settle the contract she'd made 50 years earlier. The water began to glow with this soft phosphorescent light, like there were thousands of tiny stars floating just beneath the surface. Aunt Clarice kept walking until the water was up to her chest, then up to her neck, and then she was gone. The light faded, and the river returned to normal, flowing peacefully under the night sky like nothing had happened. They found her body 3 days later, washed up on a sandbar about a mile downstream. The coroner said she'd drowned, probably had a heart attack while swimming. Nobody questioned it. In the mountains, old folks sometimes die doing things they shouldn't be doing alone. But I inherited her house and, without really understanding what I was agreeing to, her responsibility. When parents started showing up that next summer, asking if I could teach their children to swim the way Aunt Clarice had, I found myself saying yes. I was only 10 years old, but somehow I knew the words to speak to the water, knew how to ask for protection for the children who came to learn. That was 35 years ago now. I'm 45, and I still live in that same little white house by the Greenbrier River. I still give swimming lessons to children from 3 counties, and I've never lost a student, not one, just like Aunt Clarice before me. But every year, the debt grows a little larger. Every year, I can feel the spirit getting a little more impatient. And every night, I look out at that dark water and wonder how much time I have left before I'll need to walk into the river and pay what I owe. The children keep coming, though. Their parents trust me the way they trusted Aunt Clarice, and I can't bear the thought of breaking that trust. So I continue the bargain, speaking the old words and asking the ancient spirit to keep these children safe. And it does. It always does. Because some contracts, once made, can never be broken. They just get passed down from one generation to the next, along with the houses and the land and the terrible knowledge of what the mountains hide in their deepest, darkest places. I still don't know when my time will come, but I know it will come. And when it does, I hope there will be someone young and brave enough to take my place, to continue speaking the old words and keeping the children safe. Because the river is always listening, and it's always hungry.